Welcome to Mystery Stories, where quiet villages hide restless secrets and polite smiles often conceal the truth. Here, mysteries unfold slowly, through whispers over tea, careful glances, and the smallest human details that others overlook. Settle in, listen closely, and let the calm carry you into a world where every silence means something, and every path leads closer to the truth. Chapter 1. The first thing anyone mentioned that morning was not the weather, which in this village was usually the safest of topics, but the path. It began as a murmur outside the baker's shop, passed in lowered voices between the loaves and the change. Someone had been found along the hawthorn path, the one that curved gently behind the old hedges and led nowhere in particular. The sort of place people chose when they wanted a quiet walk or a moment to think. By the time Miss Marple heard of it, the murmur had grown into something heavier, pressing itself into every polite greeting and strained smile. Miss Marple paused just inside the shop doorway, her gloved hands resting lightly on the handle of her handbag. She did not rush forward, did not ask questions. She simply waited, as she always did, allowing words to float toward her of their own accord. People talked more freely, she had long noticed, when they believed they were not being listened to. "They say it was an accident," Mrs. Green whispered, leaning closer to Mrs. Bell as though the bread racks themselves might be listening. "A slip, perhaps. The ground was damp." Mrs. Bell made a doubtful sound in her throat. "On that path? I've walked it for years. It's as even as a drawing room carpet." Miss Marple's eyes lifted slightly at that. She thanked the baker, tucked her change away, and stepped back into the street, where the air felt oddly still. The hawthorn trees stood in the distance, pale blossoms trembling faintly, innocent as ever. She had walked that path herself many times. Mrs. Bell was quite right. It was not the sort of place where one simply slipped. As she made her way toward the village green, Miss Marple noticed how people avoided her gaze, then glanced back, as if reconsidering. News had a way of loosening tongues, but it also sharpened caution. Everyone wished to speak, and no one wished to be the one who spoke too much. Near the green, she encountered Mrs. Avery, who stood with a small group of women, her posture rigid, her smile carefully arranged. Mrs. Avery was known for her composure. It was often remarked upon. Today, however, something about it seemed strained. "It's all terribly sad," Mrs. Avery was saying, her voice smooth, almost brisk. But truly there was no reason for it to be anything but a dreadful misfortune. Such things do happen. Miss Marple greeted her warmly, noting how Mrs. Avery's fingers tightened around her teacup at the sound of her name. The cup rattled faintly against the saucer before being steadied again. "No reason at all?" Miss Marple said gently, as though making conversation about the weather. Mrs. Avery laughed, a little too quickly. "Oh no. None. Everyone liked him. He had no enemies. None worth mentioning, anyway." The pause before those last words was small, almost imperceptible. Miss Marple noticed it all the same. A young woman nearby leaned in, unable to contain herself. "They say someone heard footsteps last night. On the path, I mean. After dark." Mrs. Avery's smile stiffened. People hear all sorts of things at night, especially when they already know something dreadful has happened. Miss Marple nodded, as if agreeing, though her attention was caught by the way no one asked whose footsteps they might have been. Each person seemed to assume a different answer, and none of them said it aloud. Later, when the constable arrived, his boots raising small puffs of dust from the green, he was greeted with an eager hush. He spoke reassuringly, with the practiced calm of someone accustomed to smoothing village anxieties. "There's no cause for alarm," he said. "These things often look more troubling than they are at first glance. The doctor will be making a report, of course." "And the footsteps?" "Someone called." The constable smiled indulgently. Imagination travels faster than fact, especially in a place as quiet as this. Miss Marple watched him as he spoke. He meant well, That was clear enough. But she had learned long ago that well-meaning people were often the most dangerous when it came to truth. They preferred neat explanations, even when life stubbornly refused to be neat. By midday, the village had settled into an uneasy routine. Curtains twitched. Doors opened and closed with unnecessary care. Miss Marple set out toward the hawthorn path herself, walking slowly, as though she had nowhere in particular to be. The path was just as she remembered it. Soft earth, bordered by hedges that whispered gently in the breeze. Birds flitted in and out, untroubled by human concerns. It was difficult to imagine anything dreadful occurring here. And yet, that was precisely why it had unsettled the village so deeply. Near the bend, she noticed a scuffed patch of ground, half hidden by fallen blossoms. Someone had stood there for a moment, perhaps shifting their weight. It was nothing remarkable. And yet Miss Marple paused, her gaze thoughtful. She recalled Mrs. Avery's teacup, the rattling saucer, the insistence that there were no enemies. People who had nothing to hide rarely felt the need to say such things aloud. As she turned back, she encountered Mr. Collins, who was walking more briskly than usual, his hat pulled low. "Out for some air?" he said, a little too heartily. "Yes," Miss Marple replied. "The path always clears one's head." Mr. Collins nodded, then frowned, as though reconsidering. "I can't imagine why anyone would be out here so late at night," he added. "Not unless they had a reason." Miss Marple smiled at him, her expression kind. "There are many reasons people choose quiet places," she said. "Not all of them are pleasant." He shifted uncomfortably and soon made his excuses, leaving her alone with the sound of the breeze in the hawthorns. That afternoon, she paid a call on Mrs. Bell, whose house overlooked the green. Tea was poured. Biscuits were offered. The conversation circled carefully, as village conversations always did, before landing, inevitably, on the path. "I heard voices," Mrs. Bell admitted, lowering her tone. "Raised ones. But when I looked out, there was nothing to see. Voices can travel strangely," Miss Marple said, "especially when hedges are involved." "Yes," Mrs. Bell agreed quickly. Too quickly. And it was quite dark. Miss Marple wondered why Mrs. Bell felt the need to explain that detail. Darkness excused many things. It also concealed them. As she walked home later, the village seemed quieter than usual. Doors were shut. Lamps glowed behind curtains. Somewhere a clock chimed the hour, its sound oddly loud. Miss Marple paused at her gate, looking once more toward the distant line of hawthorns. She thought of footsteps, of teacups rattling, of voices heard and not seen, of how quickly the word accident had been accepted, and how eagerly it had been repeated. She felt, with a certainty born of long experience, that the path had not merely witnessed a misfortune. It had been chosen. And Miss Marple, smiling to herself with gentle resolve, knew she had just glimpsed the first shadow of a carefully hidden truth, one that would not remain concealed for long. Chapter 2. The sympathy visits began almost at once, as though the village had agreed, without quite saying so, that grief must be managed promptly, politely, and in company. It was Mrs. Linton who set the tone, opening her front door before Miss Marple had even reached for the bell, her face arranged into an expression of composed sorrow. The house smelled faintly of furniture polish and fresh tea, that particular combination meant to suggest comfort and respectability. Miss Marple stepped inside, immediately aware of how carefully everything had been placed. Cushions, aligned, curtains drawn to just the right angle. Even mourning, it seemed, had been tidied. "So very kind of you to come," Mrs. Linton said, guiding her toward the sitting room. "One must carry on, of course. Life doesn't stop, no matter how dreadful these things are." Miss Marple murmured agreement and sat, folding her hands neatly in her lap. She watched as Mrs. Linton poured tea with excessive care, the stream unbroken, the cup filled to precisely the same level as the others. It was only when she reached for the sugar bowl that her hand faltered. Just slightly. No enemies, Mrs. Linton said suddenly, as though continuing a conversation already underway. That's what everyone keeps asking. As if people go about collecting them like stamps. Miss Marple smiled gently. People often mean difficulties rather than enemies, she said. Small disagreements, perhaps. Mrs. Linton's lips pressed together. Oh, there were disagreements, of course. One can't avoid them entirely. But nothing serious. Nothing that would lead to, well. She gestured vaguely, as though unwilling to give the matter a proper shape. From the corner of the room came a soft sound, someone shifting in their chair. Miss Marple had not noticed Mr. Collins at first, seated slightly behind the lamp, his presence almost deliberately unobtrusive. Such talk is unkind, he said. At a time like this, quite so, Miss Marple replied pleasantly, though she noted how Mr. Collins avoided looking directly at her. Conversation drifted, as it always did, towards safer ground. The weather, the state of the garden, who had sent flowers. And yet, beneath it all, something tugged persistently at the edges, like a thread refusing to be ignored. It was Mrs. Linton who brought it back, though she seemed unaware she was doing so. He had been planning to leave the village, she said, lifting her cup. Just for a time, of course. A change of air can be very refreshing, Miss Marple said. Did he mention where he meant to go? Mrs. Linton hesitated, just long enough for the tea to cool untouched. No, she said finally. He didn't go into details. Mr. Collins cleared his throat. I hadn't heard that, he said. It's news to me. Mrs. Linton shot him a quick glance. He mentioned it in passing, she said. Nothing definite. Miss Marple filed the exchange away with quiet interest. People often claim things were unimportant when they were anything but. Later that afternoon, Miss Marple made her way across the village, stopping at houses where sympathy visits were expected and, indeed, eagerly given. At each one, she listened more than she spoke. She observed who leaned closer when they whispered, who lowered their voices, even when there was no one else to hear. At Mrs. Avery's, the atmosphere was notably brisk. Tea was served efficiently. Biscuits were placed with precision. I don't approve of all this speculation, Mrs. Avery said firmly. It does no one any good. Speculation can be unkind, Miss Marple agreed. But sometimes people speculate because they are trying to make sense of things. Mrs. Avery gave a thin smile. There's nothing to make sense of. A sad event. And that's all. And the argument? Miss Marple asked lightly, as though recalling something half forgotten. Mrs. Avery blinked. What argument? The one a neighbor mentioned, Miss Marple said. On the path, a few days before. Mrs. Avery's fingers tightened around her cup. People exaggerate. Raised voices can mean many things. Yes, Miss Marple said. They can. As Miss Marple rose to leave, she noticed a small stack of letters on the hall table, neatly tied with ribbon. Mrs. Avery followed her gaze and moved subtly, placing her hand over them. Correspondence, she said quickly. Old habits. Miss Marple nodded, her expression mild. Old habits were rarely abandoned all at once. Outside, the village hummed with restrained activity. Children were kept indoors. Doors closed quickly after brief exchanges. Miss Marple paused near the post office, where two women stood speaking in urgent murmurs. I heard there were documents missing, one said. Papers he kept at home. Money matters, the other replied. Always the same. They fell silent when they noticed Miss Marple, smiling politely before making their excuses. Money had a way of complicating even the simplest lives, Miss Marple reflected. It also had a way of revealing what people truly valued. As evening drew closer, she found herself once again walking the familiar lanes, the village settling into a subdued calm. Lamps were being lit. Curtains drawn. Supper smells drifted faintly on the air. She encountered Mrs. Bell near the green. her arms laden with parcels. "It's all so upsetting," Mrs. Bell said, adjusting her grip. "I can't stop thinking about it." "About what, exactly?" Miss Marple asked. "The timing," Mrs. Bell said. "Everything happened so quickly." And yet she trailed off. "And yet?" Miss Marple prompted gently. Mrs. Bell lowered her voice. "I heard someone say he'd been sorting his papers that very afternoon, as if preparing for something. Preparing to leave, perhaps. Or preparing to stay and face matters long postponed." Later at home, Miss Marple sat by the window as dusk deepened, the village sounds fading into a thoughtful quiet. She replayed the day in her mind. The careful words, the sudden silences, the way certain topics caused unease. No enemies, no serious disagreements. And yet there had been arguments, missing papers, plans to leave spoken of only in fragments. People were closing ranks, she could sense it, each one guarding their own small piece of the truth. The path behind the hawthorns came back to her, as it so often did now. Not just the place, but what it represented. A space chosen for privacy, for difficult conversations, for decisions that could not be made indoors. Miss Marple folded her hands and smiled faintly to herself. Accidents did not inspire such careful conversations. They did not require such precise recollections, and Miss Marple, gazing out at the quiet village, wondered who had needed that silence so badly, and what they had feared might be spoken aloud if they had not acted first. Chapter 3. The church bell rang with its usual calm authority that Sunday morning, steady and reassuring as though nothing in the world had shifted at all. Miss Marple noticed, however, that people arrived earlier than usual. They slipped into their seats with unusual care, greeting one another in murmurs rather than smiles, the familiar rhythm of worship altered by something unspoken. Even the sound of footsteps along the stone aisles seemed louder than it ought to have been. She took her place near the middle, where she could see without being seen too much herself. From here, she observed the subtle rearrangement of village alliances. Mrs. Avery chose a pew several rows back from Mrs. Linton, though they usually sat together. Mr. Collins arrived late and slipped into a side seat, his head bowed, not in reverence, but avoidance. Miss Marple took note of these small changes. People revealed more by where they sat than by what they said. The vicar's voice flowed smoothly through the opening prayers, but Miss Marple sensed his careful restraint whenever he came near certain phrases. Loss was mentioned, yes. Sorrow, too. But never the name, never the place. As though by leaving such things unsaid, they might lose their power. When the hymn books were opened, a faint rustle passed through the congregation. Miss Marple noticed Mrs. Grant pause, her fingers lingering between pages before she settled on the correct one. Something slipped free and fluttered down, landing softly at her feet. Mrs. Grant froze. Miss Marple leaned forward slightly and retrieved it before anyone else could notice. It was a folded note, worn at the creases, as though it had been opened and closed many times. She did not read it. Not yet. She simply held it, feeling its weight, its quiet insistence. After the service, the churchyard filled with polite conversation, voices lowered but urgent, each exchange carrying more meaning than it appeared. Miss Marple lingered near the ledger table inside, where names were entered with neat devotion, donations recorded in careful columns. "I was surprised," Mrs. Grant said softly to Mrs. Bell, not realizing Miss Marple stood close enough to hear. He withdrew it entirely. After all that talk, Mrs. Bell's eyes widened. After promising? Mrs. Grant nodded, her mouth tightening. Only days before. Miss Marple glanced at the ledger. A familiar name appeared, then stopped abruptly. No final flourish, no concluding sum. A promise made, then quietly taken back. Outside, she approached the vicar with her usual gentle smile. "Such a thoughtful service," she said, "though I imagine these weeks have been rather trying." The vicar sighed, smoothing his sleeve. The village feels things deeply, even when they pretend not to. And the donation, Miss Marple added lightly. That must have been disappointing. His head lifted too quickly. I beg your pardon? The one that was discussed, she said, then withdrawn. He hesitated, then nodded. Circumstances change. Indeed they do, Miss Marple replied. Often very suddenly. He excused himself soon after, leaving Miss Marple alone with her thoughts and the note still folded neatly in her pocket. She waited until she reached the privacy of her sitting room before opening it. The handwriting was hurried, the ink pressed deeply into the paper. We need to speak. Tonight. The path. It cannot wait any longer. No name. No signature. Only urgency. Miss Marple sat back, the note resting lightly in her hand. So. A meeting. Not accidental, then. Arranged. Chosen. That afternoon, she paid a visit to Mrs. Grant under the pleasant excuse of returning a borrowed book. Mrs. Grant ushered her in with obvious relief, as though eager for company. I don't like secrets, Mrs. Grant said suddenly, once tea had been poured. They sit badly with me. Miss Marple smiled. Most things do. Eventually. Mrs. Grant twisted her napkin. He had promised that donation months ago. Said it was a matter of conscience. And then? Miss Marple asked. And then he changed his mind, Mrs. Grant said sharply. After someone spoke to him. I don't know who. He wouldn't say. Miss Marple's gaze drifted to the window. People are often persuaded more easily than they realize. Mrs. Grant leaned forward. He was frightened. I could see it. He kept looking over his shoulder, as though expecting someone to appear. Fear can be a powerful motivator, Miss Marple said softly. As she left, she encountered Mr. Collins near the gate, his expression strained. I hear you've been asking questions, he said. Oh, I do so enjoy listening, Miss Marple replied. People tell me such interesting things. He laughed, but the sound lacked warmth. Best not to listen too closely. One might hear something untrue. Or something very true, Miss Marple said gently. He flushed and walked away without another word. That evening, Miss Marple took a slow walk past the church once more. The building stood silent now, its windows dark, its doors firmly shut. She paused near the ledger room, recalling the abrupt end of that familiar line of giving. Promises withdrawn. Notes written in haste. Meetings arranged in quiet places. She thought of the path again, not merely a place for walking, but a place for decisions that could not be spoken aloud in daylight. As she turned for home, she heard voices ahead. Mrs. Avery and Mrs. Linton stood together, their heads bent close. It was never meant to come to this, Mrs. Linton said, her voice tight. Mrs. Avery replied sharply. Then it should have been settled sooner. They fell silent when they noticed Miss Marple, smiles returning with impressive speed. That night, as Miss Marple prepared for bed, she placed the note carefully inside her book, marking the page without marking the truth. She felt no triumph, only a steady certainty growing clearer with each quiet revelation. This had not been a chance encounter on a quiet path. It had been arranged, anticipated, and feared. And Miss Marple, extinguishing her lamp, knew that somewhere between the church ledger and the hawthorn hedge, a promise had been broken. And the cost of that silence was far greater than the village yet dared to admit. Chapter 4. The house stood at the edge of the village like a polite observer that had seen too much and learned to keep quiet. Miss Marple noticed it immediately, the way it faced slightly away from the road, as though turning its shoulder to passing eyes. Most village houses angled themselves toward the street, welcoming conversation and curiosity. This one did not. It seemed to prefer discretion. That, Miss Marple reflected, was rarely accidental. She arrived mid-morning, invited under the acceptable pretense of offering condolences. The front door was opened by the servant, a young woman whose eyes flicked briefly toward the sitting room before she stepped aside. The smell inside was faintly sharp, a mixture of cleaning polish and something more hurried, as though the house had been scrubbed too thoroughly. "Everything's been put in order," the girl said quickly, as if apologizing in advance. Miss Marple smiled kindly. "That's quite understandable." The sitting room was immaculate. Too immaculate. Chairs were aligned with careful precision, cushions plumped as though they had never known the weight of a human body. Miss Marple's gaze lingered on one particular chair near the window. Its cushion bore the faintest depression, not yet fully recovered, as if someone had been sitting there recently, and often. "He used to like that chair," the servant said, noticing her attention. "Said it caught the light just right." "And did he often have company?" Miss Marple asked, her tone idle. The girl hesitated. From time to time meant regularly, Miss Marple knew. It was the phrase people used when they wished to be vague without appearing secretive. Mrs. Linton entered a moment later, her expression composed, her movements precise. She gestured for tea to be brought, then settled herself opposite Miss Marple, hands folded neatly. "It's been such a strain," she said. "Managing everything." "I can imagine," Miss Marple replied. "Houses feel very different when someone is suddenly absent." "Yes," Mrs. Linton said. "Very different." Her eyes moved, just briefly, toward the window that overlooked the hawthorn path. Miss Marple noticed. They spoke of ordinary things at first. Arrangements. Letters to be written. The inconvenience of interrupted routines. Yet beneath it all ran a current of tension, tightening whenever the conversation drifted too close to the previous evening. "It was all so sudden," Mrs. Linton said at last. "No warning at all." "No warning?" Miss Marple echoed gently. "Well," Mrs. Linton amended quickly, "nothing one would recognize as such." Miss Marple nodded. Warnings are often clearer in hindsight. Tea was poured. Cups were lifted, and once again Miss Marple observed that particular stillness that came just before truth intruded. "I understand there was some discussion here that night," Miss Marple said lightly. "Voices, perhaps?" Mrs. Linton's hand stilled. The servant must have misunderstood. The servant, standing near the doorway, shifted her weight. "I only meant," she began, then stopped. Mrs. Linton's smile sharpened. "It was nothing." Miss Marple inclined her head. "Of course, after tea she asked to see the rest of the house, phrasing it as simple curiosity." Mrs. Linton agreed a little too readily, rising at once, as though eager to demonstrate that there was nothing to hide. They passed through the hallway toward the back door. Miss Marple's gaze dropped briefly to the floor, where a faint smear of dried mud lingered near the threshold. It had been wiped, but not entirely removed. "So careless of us," Mrs. Linton said, following her glance. "With all the coming and going?" "Yes," Miss Marple said softly. "Quite a lot of coming and going." Outside, the small yard was neat, the garden beds freshly turned. Miss Marple noted how recently the soil had been disturbed, too recently for routine tending. "You've been busy," she remarked. "It helps to keep occupied," Mrs. Linton replied. Miss Marple wondered what, exactly, had been placed into that soil, or removed from it. As they turned back inside, the servant lingered, her expression troubled. "I heard them arguing," she said suddenly. "That night." Mrs. Linton stiffened. "You heard raised voices," she corrected. The girl flushed. "Yes, that's what I meant." Miss Marple smiled at her encouragingly. "Arguments can sound worse when doors are closed. They weren't always," the girl said before she could stop herself. Mrs. Linton drew a breath. "That will be all," she said sharply. The servant retreated, leaving behind a silence thick with meaning. Miss Marple did not press the point. She had learned that people often revealed more when allowed to retreat than when forced forward. Later, she excused herself and stepped outside, choosing not the front path but the narrow track that led toward the hawthorns. The ground here was uneven, softened by recent damp. Near the hedge, she noticed a footprint, its edges blurred but still discernible. Someone had tried to erase it, but haste had left a trace. She stood there for a moment, imagining the scene. Voices raised, words spoken that could not be taken back. A decision made in that narrow space between fear and resolve. On her way back, she encountered Mr. Collins emerging from the side gate, his expression startled. "Oh," he said. "I didn't realize anyone was about. I was just leaving," Miss Marple said pleasantly. He glanced behind him, then back at her. "This is all terribly unfortunate." "Yes," Miss Marple agreed. "Unfortunate for many reasons." His gaze flicked toward the house. "People will talk." "They always do," Miss Marple said. "Especially when they sense something has been arranged rather than allowed to happen." He opened his mouth as though to respond, then thought better of it. "Good day," he said stiffly and walked away. As Miss Marple returned home, the image of that carefully arranged sitting room stayed with her. The spotless windows, the single chair that bore the memory of frequent use, the servant's half-spoken confession, the hurried cleaning that spoke of anxiety rather than grief. Houses absorbed the habits of those who lived within them. They remembered what people tried to forget. That evening, as shadows lengthened and the village settled into its quiet routines, Miss Marple sat by her window once more. She pictured the house turned slightly away from the road, guarding its secrets with polite determination. Someone had been a regular visitor there, someone whose presence had mattered enough to inspire arguments, fear, and hurried attempts at order. And Miss Marple, watching the last light fade over the rooftops, felt certain that the house itself had testified, quietly, persistently, that the truth was not found on the path alone, but in the careful way people tried to erase what had happened before they ever stepped onto it. Chapter 5. The first thing Miss Marple noticed that morning was how quickly people stopped speaking when she approached. It happened outside the post office, where two women stood close together, heads inclined, voices animated just seconds before. As Miss Marple stepped nearer, the conversation folded itself away with remarkable speed, replaced by smiles that were far too bright for so early in the day. "Such a relief the weather's holding," one of them said, too loudly. Miss Marple smiled back, warmly, and moved on, filing the moment away. Silence, she had often observed, could be more revealing than gossip, especially when it arrived so abruptly. Inside the post office, the air smelled of paper and ink, with a faint undercurrent of nerves. Miss Marple waited her turn patiently, listening without appearing to do so. "They haven't found the letters," a man murmured to the clerk. "No," came the reply, equally low, "and that's what's troubling people." Miss Marple stepped forward just then, requesting stamps in her mild, unhurried voice. The exchange ended at once. She thanked the clerk and left, her thoughts already moving ahead of her. Letters. It was the second time she had heard them mentioned. Missing letters rarely vanished on their own. Later that morning, she paid a visit to Mrs. Avery, who had insisted, perhaps a little too insistently, that Miss Marple must come in for tea whenever she pleased. The house was warm and orderly, the curtains drawn back to let in as much light as possible, as though brightness itself might discourage darker thoughts. Mrs. Avery poured tea briskly, her movements efficient, practiced. "I don't know how the village will ever feel normal again," she said. "People are making such a fuss." "People often do," Miss Marple replied gently. "When something unsettles their sense of order." Mrs. Avery gave a short laugh. "Well, I've always said order is essential." Miss Marple noticed how Mrs. Avery's gaze flicked toward the writing desk near the window, then away again. "How fortunate," Miss Marple said lightly, "that you keep all your correspondence so neatly arranged." Mrs. Avery's hand paused mid-pour. Tea splashed dangerously close to the rim before she steadied it. "I believe in tidiness," she said. "Papers have a way of causing trouble when they're left about." Yes, Miss Marple agreed. "They do have a habit of saying things when one least expects it." Mrs. Avery smiled thinly and changed the subject with remarkable speed, launching into a detailed account of the week's household tasks. Miss Marple listened politely, but her attention lingered on the desk. One drawer sat just slightly ajar. Not enough to be obvious, enough to be noticed by someone who was looking. When Miss Marple rose to leave, Mrs. Avery followed her into the hallway. "I hope," she said carefully, "that you're not paying too much attention to village talk." Miss Marple met her gaze. "Village talk often reflects village truths," she said kindly. Mrs. Avery's smile did not reach her eyes. Outside, Miss Marple paused, taking a slow breath. Mrs. Avery was not the sort of woman who misplaced letters. Nor, Miss Marple suspected, was she the sort who destroyed them lightly, which suggested something else entirely. That afternoon, Miss Marple encountered Mr. Collins near the green, standing with his hands clasped behind his back, staring at nothing in particular. He looked up sharply when she greeted him. "Good afternoon," he said. "Out walking again?" "Yes," Miss Marple replied. "I find walking helps one think." "Thinking can be dangerous," Mr. Collins said with a laugh that did not quite ring true. "Especially when one doesn't have all the facts." Miss Marple tilted her head. "Facts have a way of surfacing eventually." Mr. Collins shifted his weight. "There's been a lot of talk about letters," he said abruptly. "Pure nonsense, if you ask me." "Letters can be quite powerful," Miss Marple said. "Depending on what they contain," he frowned. "You sound as though you've seen them." "I've seen the effect their absence has," Miss Marple replied. A flush crept up his neck. "People read too much into things." "People often read too little," Miss Marple said gently. He muttered something about errands and walked away, his steps quicker than necessary. Miss Marple continued on her way, her thoughts settling into a clearer pattern. Letters. Arguments. A donation withdrawn. A meeting arranged in haste. Each piece alone meant little. Together, they suggested a private conflict that had spilled dangerously into public consequence. In the late afternoon, she paid a call on Mrs. Bell, who received her with visible relief. "I'm glad you came," Mrs. Bell said. "It's all been weighing on me." Tea was poured. Curtains fluttered slightly in the open window. "I heard something," Mrs. Bell said, leaning forward. "About a business venture. Something that went wrong." Miss Marple nodded encouragingly. "People often take risks they later regret." "It involved money," Mrs. Bell went on. "And trust. He'd promised help. Then changed his mind." Miss Marple's expression remained serene. "Promises are powerful things." "Yes," Mrs. Bell said. "And breaking them can make people desperate." The word hung between them. As Miss Marple left, she noticed a familiar figure across the street, Mrs. Linton, standing in her doorway, watching. When their eyes met, Mrs. Linton looked away at once. That evening, Miss Marple sat by her writing desk, sorting her own modest correspondence. She reflected on how letters, so harmless in appearance, could hold entire lives within them. Confessions. Threats. Proof. She imagined a bundle of letters, tied neatly with ribbon. Then imagined them gone. Someone had removed them deliberately. Someone who feared what they said. The village grew quieter as night fell. The sort of quiet that pressed inward rather than outward. Miss Marple stood at her window, watching lamps flicker on one by one. She thought of Mrs. Avery's drawer, of Mr. Collins's defensiveness, of Mrs. Linton's watchful silence. Each guarded something different. Each had something to lose. And somewhere among them lay the truth, folded carefully away, waiting for the moment it could no longer be contained. Miss Marple smiled faintly, not with satisfaction, but with understanding. People often believed that destroying evidence erased guilt. In reality, it merely shifted it into behavior, into tone, into the smallest, most telling gestures. And Miss Marple, turning out the light, felt certain that the missing letters had not vanished at all. They had merely changed form, revealing themselves now in the careful lies and anxious glances of those who feared what had once been written down. Chapter 6. Dusk crept into the village with unusual softness that evening, as though reluctant to disturb what had already been unsettled. Miss Marple noticed it first in the way doors were closed earlier than usual and the lamps lit before their customary hour. The village was preparing itself for night, with a care that bordered on unease. She took her shawl and stepped out just as the sky deepened to a muted blue, the kind that made distances feel uncertain. It was the path that drew her again. The hawthorn path had become, in these days, the village's unspoken thought, hovering at the back of every conversation. People pretended not to notice it. Miss Marple did not pretend at all. As she walked, she let her steps fall naturally, neither hurried nor hesitant. The hedges whispered softly, stirred by the evening breeze, carrying sounds farther than one might expect. Voices, for instance. Or footsteps. She paused near the bend where the ground dipped slightly, recalling how easily sound traveled here. One did not need to shout. A raised voice would do. Even a sharply spoken sentence. You can't simply leave it like this. The words were not spoken now, of course. But Miss Marple heard them all the same, imagined from fragments she had already gathered. People repeated arguments unconsciously when they recalled them. Tone lingered long after words were forgotten. She stooped briefly, examining the earth near the hedge. The ground had dried since her last visit, but faint disturbances remained. A heel had pressed more deeply here. A step had faltered there. Not the marks of a leisurely walk. Behind her came the soft crunch of gravel. Miss Marple straightened slowly and turned, her expression untroubled. Mrs. Bell stood a little distance away, her face pale in the dimming light. "Oh," Mrs. Bell said, "I didn't expect anyone else to be out here." "I find the air pleasant at this hour," Miss Marple replied. "It helps one think." Mrs. Bell nodded, wringing her hands. "I don't like this path anymore." "No," Miss Marple agreed. "It's changed its character." Mrs. Bell hesitated. "I saw someone here that evening," she said at last. "Not clearly. Just two figures. One taller than the other." "And you didn't recognize them?" Miss Marple asked. Mrs. Bell shook her head. "It was too dark, but I know the voices." She stopped herself abruptly. Miss Marple waited. One sounded angry. Mrs. Bell finished. The other, frightened. Fear again. It surfaced everywhere now, thinly disguised. They parted soon after, Mrs. Bell retreating quickly toward the village lights. Miss Marple continued on, her mind turning over the detail. Anger and fear rarely met without consequence. Near the far end of the path, she encountered Mr. Collins, leaning against the hedge as though he had been there for some time. He straightened when he saw her, his expression unreadable. "Out late," he said. "So are you," Miss Marple replied. He gave a short laugh. "I couldn't sleep." "Many people find sleep difficult when matters remain unsettled," Miss Marple said. His gaze flicked away. "You've been asking questions." "I've been listening," she corrected gently. "There's a difference," he said sharply, then softened his tone at once. "Forgive me. These days have been trying." "Yes," Miss Marple said. "They often are, when people say more than they meant to." He frowned. "What do you mean by that?" "Nothing in particular," she said pleasantly. "Only that words spoken in haste tend to linger." He shifted his stance. "People heard footsteps," he said. "But footsteps prove nothing." "On their own, no," Miss Marple agreed. "But they can confirm timing." His jaw tightened. "Timing is unreliable." "Not always," Miss Marple said. "Especially when it involves habits." He looked at her sharply. "What habits?" Miss Marple smiled faintly. "Returning library books, for instance." Color rose in his face. "That's absurd." "Is it?" Miss Marple said softly. "Libraries keep careful records." For a moment, it seemed he might say more. Then he stepped back, creating distance where there had been none. "I should go," he muttered. "Yes," Miss Marple said. "It's growing dark." He left quickly, his footsteps uneven. disappearing toward the village. Miss Marple stood still for a moment longer, listening. The path settled again, the sounds of the village distant but present. She imagined the sequence now with greater clarity. A meeting arranged. Words exchanged. Someone arriving later than planned. Someone else noticing. The timing of things had begun to align themselves, like pieces finally recognizing their place. As she turned back, she noticed something she had missed before. A faint scrape along the low wooden post near the bend. A mark left by something brushed against it. Or someone. Later that night, back in her sitting room, Miss Marple reviewed the day quietly. Mrs. Bell's voices. Mr. Collins's defensiveness. The library record he had forgotten to consider. People often constructed alibis from routines they believed too dull to be questioned. They forgot that dullness itself could be distinctive. She poured herself a small cup of tea and sat by the window, watching the darkness deepen outside. Somewhere, a door closed. Somewhere else, a clock struck the hour. The path lay invisible now, hidden in shadow, but Miss Marple could see it clearly in her mind. Not just the place, but the moment. The raised voice. The fearful one. The realization that something spoken could not be taken back. And Miss Marple, sipping her tea thoughtfully, felt certain that the path at dusk had not merely witnessed the truth. It had measured it, step by careful step, waiting patiently for someone clever enough to read what it had been forced to remember. Chapter 7. The invitation was delivered so casually that no one thought to question it. Miss Marple had mentioned tea, nothing more alarming than that, during a chance encounter near the green. Her tone light, her smile warm. She suggested it might be pleasant to sit together for an hour, to enjoy something familiar after such a trying week. People were grateful for the excuse. Routine was comforting. Tea meant safety. By 4 o'clock, they had arrived. Mrs. Avery came first, her posture upright, her expression composed with practiced precision. Mrs. Linton followed, gloved and neat, her eyes moving quickly about the room before settling on Miss Marple with polite relief. Mr. Collins arrived last, a few minutes late, apologizing more than necessary, his smile flickering at the edges. Miss Marple welcomed them all with gentle efficiency. The sitting room was warm, the curtains half drawn, the light softened just enough to encourage ease. Cups were arranged, biscuits offered. Everything felt ordinary. That, Miss Marple knew, was the most effective way to begin. Conversation drifted easily at first. The weather, the garden. How strange it felt to return to small talk when everything seemed slightly altered beneath it. Miss Marple listened, nodded, asked questions that invited comfort rather than caution. It was Mrs. Avery who mentioned the path. "I can hardly bear to walk that way now," she said, stirring her tea though it no longer needed it. "Such a pleasant place, ruined by all this unpleasantness." "Yes," Miss Marple said mildly. "Places absorb memories, don't they?" Mrs. Linton's spoon paused mid-air. "I suppose they do." Mr. Collins cleared his throat. "I imagine people will avoid it for some time." "Perhaps," Miss Marple said, "though avoidance doesn't always erase memory." She rose then, moving toward the side table. "More tea?" They murmured assent, grateful for the interruption. Miss Marple poured carefully, noticing how Mrs. Linton held her cup too tightly, how Mrs. Avery sat very straight indeed, as though posture alone could ward off discomfort. When Miss Marple returned to her seat, she did not sit at once. "I had a most interesting conversation earlier," she said pleasantly, "with Mrs. Bell." Mrs. Avery looked up sharply. "Did you?" "Yes," Miss Marple replied. "She mentioned hearing voices on the path. 2 of them." Mr. Collins stiffened almost imperceptibly. "It's all hearsay," Mrs. Avery said quickly. "People imagine things." "Of course," Miss Marple said, "though it's curious how often imagined things align." She sat now, folding her hands. One voice was described as angry. The other, frightened. Silence settled, thick but not yet brittle. "Fear," Miss Marple continued softly, has a very particular sound. It's quite different from excitement or irritation. Mrs. Linton swallowed. People argue, she said. That doesn't mean— Of course not, Miss Marple interrupted gently. Arguments happen every day. It's the subject of the argument that matters. She let that sit for a moment before continuing. Money, for instance. Or promises. Or letters. Mrs. Avery's gaze flicked toward the window. Mr. Collins shifted in his chair. There's been a great deal of talk about letters, Mr. Collins said tightly. Unfounded talk? Missing letters do tend to invite curiosity, Miss Marple replied. Especially when they are known to exist. Mrs. Avery laughed, though it sounded thin. You make it sound as though they were terribly important. Importance is a matter of perspective, Miss Marple said. To some, a letter is merely paper. To others, it is leverage. Mrs. Linton's cup rattled faintly as she set it down. Miss Marple's tone remained kind. It must be very tiring, she said, to carry so many worries alone. Mrs. Linton looked up. I beg your pardon? Keeping track of who knows what, Miss Marple said. Who heard what? Who might speak? Mrs. Avery drew herself up. Are you suggesting something, Miss Marple? Oh no, Miss Marple said quickly. I'm merely observing how difficult it is to maintain a story when it wasn't meant to be told in the first place. Mr. Collins stood abruptly. This is quite enough. Miss Marple did not look startled. She looked thoughtful. You're quite right, she said. There is one thing we haven't discussed properly. He hesitated, then slowly sat again. The timing, Miss Marple said. So many of our questions returned to it. Mrs. Avery frowned. Timing proves nothing. Not on its own, Miss Marple agreed. But combined with habit, it becomes quite revealing. She turned her gaze to Mr. Collins. You mentioned some days ago how unreliable timing could be. He nodded cautiously. And yet, Miss Marple went on, you are a man of routine, are you not? He said nothing. Library visits, for example, she said lightly. Returning books on certain evenings. Mrs. Avery glanced between them. What has that to do with? Libraries keep careful records, Miss Marple said. Dates, times. Mr. Collins's face had gone pale. You said you were elsewhere that evening. Miss Marple continued gently. At a place that closes earlier than you realized. That's absurd, he said hoarsely. Is it? Miss Marple asked, because the record suggests otherwise. Silence fell heavily now. Miss Marple sighed softly. It's such a pity, she said. All this trouble over something that might have been resolved with honesty. Mrs. Linton spoke suddenly, her voice strained. You don't understand. He was going to ruin everything. Miss Marple turned to her. Because of what he planned to say? Mrs. Linton's hands trembled. Because of what he had written. Mrs. Avery gasped. You said those letters were gone. They were, Mrs. Linton said. But not before they were read. Miss Marple nodded slowly. And once read, they could not be unread. Mr. Collins covered his face with his hands. I only meant to speak to him, he said. To make him see reason. On the path, Miss Marple said quietly. At dusk. He was frightened, Mrs. Linton whispered. He said he'd tell everything if we didn't stop him. Miss Marple's voice was gentle but firm. And fear met anger. Mr. Collins looked up, tears in his eyes. He slipped. Perhaps, Miss Marple said. Or perhaps he was pushed. No one spoke. The room seemed to exhale all at once, the careful politeness finally exhausted. Miss Marple rose slowly. You see, she said, it was never about the path, or the darkness, or even the letters. She looked at them, one by one. It was about control, about silencing a truth before it could change everything. Mrs. Avery sank back into her chair. What will happen now? Miss Marple folded her hands. That is no longer for me to decide. She moved to the window, gazing out at the quiet village beyond. Lamps glowed softly. Life went on, as it always did. Behind her, the truth lay exposed, stripped of its careful arrangements. Miss Marple turned back, her expression kind, almost sorrowful. It's so often the case, she said. that people believe they are protecting themselves. They forget that truth has a way of finding its voice. The silence that followed was no longer defensive. It was resigned. And Miss Marple, watching them carefully, knew that the final step had been taken. Not on the path behind the hawthorns, but here, in a warm room, over tea, where the last and most dangerous assumption had quietly fallen away. Chapter 8. The village woke the next morning with a careful sort of calm, the kind that followed a long-held breath finally released. Miss Marple noticed it as she drew back her curtains. The light seemed softer, less tentative. Somewhere down the lane, a door opened and closed with an ordinary sound, not the hurried click of recent days. Even so, she knew the quiet was not the same as peace. Truth, once spoken, did not immediately settle. It rearranged things first. She set out after breakfast, walking slowly, as though the day belonged to her. People greeted her with polite warmth that carried a new undertone, relief, perhaps, mixed with uncertainty. They knew something had changed. Villages always knew. They simply waited for permission to say so aloud. At the green, she found the constable speaking quietly with Mrs. Bell. Both looked up when Miss Marple approached. Mrs. Bell's eyes shone with unshed emotion, though her mouth held steady. "It's a comfort," Mrs. Bell said softly, "to know things are finally being put right." Miss Marple inclined her head. "Clarity has that effect." The constable cleared his throat. "We'll be making arrangements," he said, careful with his words. "There are procedures." "Of course," Miss Marple replied. "There always are." He hesitated. If only someone had spoken sooner. Miss Marple smiled kindly. People often speak when they can no longer remain silent. Not before. She left them then, continuing toward the hawthorn path. It felt important to walk it once more, now that its purpose had been fully understood. The trees stood as they always had, blossoms pale against the morning sky. Birds moved freely between branches, unconcerned with human affairs. Near the bend, she paused, listening. There were no echoes now, no imagined voices, only the soft sound of leaves and the distant hum of village life returning to itself. It had happened here. Not by chance, not by accident, but through a moment of terrible certainty. Words had been spoken that could not be taken back. Fear had sharpened resolve. A step had been misjudged, or forced. The path had offered privacy, and privacy had been misused. Miss Marple did not linger long. She had never believed places were to blame. People made their own choices, even when they convinced themselves otherwise. By late morning, she had been invited, quietly, carefully, to Mrs. Linton's house. The invitation came through the servant, her eyes wide with a mixture of dread and relief. Mrs. Linton received Miss Marple in the same immaculate sitting room. Though something had changed, the chairs were no longer aligned with such rigid precision. One cushion remained slightly askew. "I didn't sleep," Mrs. Linton said at once, dispensing with pleasantries. "I kept hearing my own voice." Miss Marple sat, her manner gentle. "That can happen when one has been holding something back." Mrs. Linton's hands twisted in her lap. "We never meant it to go so far." "Intentions are rarely simple," Miss Marple said, "especially when fear is involved." Mrs. Linton closed her eyes. "He said he would speak. About the letters. About everything." "Yes," Miss Marple said quietly. He had decided not to be silent any longer. "He said it was a matter of conscience," Mrs. Linton whispered. "That he couldn't carry it anymore." Miss Marple thought of the withdrawn donation, the hurried note, the meeting arranged in haste. Conscience had a way of demanding payment at the most inconvenient times. Mr. Collins entered then, his face drawn, his movements hesitant. He did not sit at once. "I didn't plan it," he said, as though continuing a conversation already begun. "I only wanted to frighten him into stopping." Miss Marple looked at him steadily. "Fear is a dangerous tool. It rarely behaves as intended." He swallowed. "He accused me," Said the letters proved everything. They proved enough, Miss Marple said gently. Enough to change lives. Mrs. Avery arrived soon after, her composure finally broken. She stood near the doorway, as though unsure she deserved a place in the room. I told myself it was necessary, she said. That protecting our reputations was worth it. Reputations, Miss Marple said softly, are fragile things to build decisions upon. Mrs. Avery pressed her lips together. If those letters had been shared, they would have revealed what was already true, Miss Marple said, only hidden. Silence settled over them. Heavy but honest. You see, Miss Marple continued, her voice warm but unwavering. Each of you contributed a piece. Pressure, fear, silence. None of you intended this end, but each step made the next one easier. Mr. Collins sank into a chair, covering his face. I wish I could undo it. Wishing, Miss Marple said, is the last refuge of certainty arriving too late. There was a knock at the door then. The constable entered, his manner respectful, his expression grave but not unkind. He spoke quietly, explaining what would happen next, what arrangements must be made. No raised voices, no drama, just consequence. As they spoke, Miss Marple rose and moved to the window, gazing out toward the path once more. She did not need to hear every word. The truth had already settled. When she returned to her chair, the room felt emptier somehow, though no one had left yet. Something invisible had been removed. By afternoon, the village began to speak openly at last. Not loudly, not with excitement, but with the steady release of tension that had bound it too tightly. Miss Marple walked through the lanes, exchanging quiet greetings. Mrs. Bell stopped her, squeezing her hand briefly. The baker nodded with unspoken gratitude. Even the post office felt lighter, the air less burdened. At the church, the ledger lay open on the small table. Miss Marple paused beside it, tracing the familiar lines with her eyes. Promises made. Promises withdrawn. Promises broken. She thought of how close the truth had come to remaining hidden forever, buried beneath politeness and fear. How easily the village might have accepted a convenient explanation. But truth, Miss Marple knew, had a persistence all its own. It waited, it watched, and it surfaced, often through the smallest cracks. As evening fell, she returned home and prepared a simple supper. The radio murmured quietly, filling the space without demanding attention. She ate slowly, thoughtfully. Later, she sat by the window with a cup of tea, watching the village settle into night. Lamps glowed softly. Curtains were drawn. Somewhere, laughter drifted briefly, tentative but real. The hawthorn path lay beyond her view now, wrapped in shadow. It would take time before it felt ordinary again. Perhaps it never would. But it no longer held unanswered questions, and that, Miss Marple believed, mattered more. She reflected on how close the village had come to mistaking silence for safety, on how fear had driven good people to make terrible choices, on how truth, once threatened, had fought its way back through gossip, habit, and quiet observation. Miss Marple smiled faintly, not with satisfaction, but with acceptance. This was the pattern she had seen all her life. Human nature did not change. It only repeated itself in different houses, on different paths. She extinguished the lamp and prepared for bed, the house settling around her with familiar sounds. Tomorrow, the village would wake and begin again, altered but intact. And Miss Marple, closing her eyes at last, knew that the path behind the hawthorns would always remain what it had been. A place for quiet walks and gentle greetings, yes, but also a reminder that even the most peaceful roads can lead to difficult truths, and that it is only by facing them calmly, And honestly, that a village can truly find its way home.